Welcome one and all. Step right up and get your tickets for another moment in gaming history.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, or if you're new here, welcome officially to the channel. This is a series where I go into various different moments in video game history, and today, let's say I found myself looking back at one of the first big hits in the arcades, the one that propelled many businesses into the video game scene, and that's the pinball machine. Most of us, well, at least if you're of a certain age, have played one at one point or another, but how far do they go back? What do they owe their origins to, and what companies owe their beginnings to them? Well, if you have a moment, sit back and hang out a while as we go into some of these things. Now, many of us are aware that pinball was one of the biggest things in the 60s and 70s until video games started to break out with games like Computer Space and Pong, both made by Atari, that honestly owed much of their early success and funding to the pinball industry. But who made the first pinball machine? What was its influence? Well, let's start with the influence, shall we? From the digging I've done, it looks like pinball was derived from a game known as bagatelle. Now, this is an indoor version of billiards like table game where the object was to get a set number of balls, commonly 9, past a series of wooden pins and into holes that were guarded by more wooden pegs. The player would use a striker, for lack of a better term. It was sort of like a short cue stick, to aim the ball. In many ways, these tables looked a lot like snooker tables, or a more horizontal pachinko board. In fact, pachinko-like versions of these would be developed and primarily aimed at kids, many of them using steel ball bearings looking balls that would be hit with a short cue-like stick, or striker, to send the balls up into the playing field. This obviously removed a lot of the finer technique of the ricocheting the ball off the pins to hit harder targets and left, well, most of the scoring to chance. Many of you may think this looks an awful lot like a cheap toy you had in the 80s, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Many handheld pinball machines look much like this design. These things used to be everywhere in gas stations back in the day, I kid you not. Now, the bagatelle design would actually go on to influence billiards as well, and eventually the first pinball machine that was made by Automatic Industries in 1931. Yeah, this goes back that far. This was known as a wiffle board. The wiffle board had a few changes from the original bagatelle table, and they found a way to separate the player from the board. Basically, what they did is they put a piece of glass between you and the actual board, and they had a way to automatically turn the balls and charge for play. How this worked was the player paid roughly for 10 balls, and from what I can tell, they would use a spinner on the side to strike the ball up into the playing field, and from there it would come down and act much like a pachinko machine, leaving most things to chance. You'll note that this one is missing flippers of any kind to give the player any kind of control over the ball. Now, the next modification to this design would be made by a company called Bally, who made the Ballyhoo machine. This was a modification of the wiffle machine with a spring-loaded striker. Other than that, it operated basically the same. Flippers actually wouldn't show up until the late 1947-ish era, when Humpty Dumpty, which honestly had flippers but had them facing outward instead of towards each other, which was a strange design, but notable for the fact that it's just so odd by common standards. It was also around this time that pinball fell out of fashion, in part due to World War II. And that was basically because it was made illegal due to links and gambling in major cities. Honestly, if memory serves, the mob got involved in gambling with pinball machines, because the mob. Now, pinball wouldn't see another major revival till right around the 1970s, and around this time, things like LEDs and microprocessors would start to bring the pinball machine into the modern electronic era. However, this proved to be kind of a short-lived resurgence, as the rise of the actual video game would see these larger, more maintenance-heavy machines replaced with smaller, easier to maintain, and far more reliable and flexible video arcade machines. This isn't to say that pinball machines would go away entirely. They were still around, but they wouldn't have another major resurgence in the States until the video game crash of 1983 in the States. Around this time, many manufacturers would pull out of the industry entirely, and some of them would go back into pinball, at least for a time. In the late 80s and early 90s, many of the major players would start to leave the pinball industry, leaving really only Sega and Williams left as the others all went back into video games. Eventually, Sega would sell their particular interest to Gary Turn, who was the president of Sega Pinball at the time. He would then form Stern Pinball. Stern Pinball would end up being the very last manufacturer of pinball machines when Williams would exit and make gaming equipment for casinos, licensing their rights to Stern Pinball. They continued to function until right around 2013. Now, this wouldn't be the last we would see of pinball. Around this time, different manufacturers like Chicago Gaming Company began making cabinets and coming out with ones in 2013. And they would continue to make them all the way up to the current day of 2023, with the Pulp Fiction cabinet being released. Now, they wouldn't be the only ones to enter in. Other companies like Dutch Pinball, Multimorphic, America Pinball, and Flutter would all enter into the market over the years and start making pinball machines again, but not to the same level that they were made in the 40s, 50s, and 70s. With all these new manufacturers, it's pretty safe to say that while pinball doesn't have the exact same appeal it had in the earlier eras, it does have a lasting and passionate fan base willing to go to the well time and time again to keep this popular pastime alive and well. The fact that its earliest ancestor, the Bagatelle, influenced not only pinball but pachinko and billiards also cannot be understated as the major influence in the gaming industry as a whole. However, what do you guys think of this one? Did any of you know this particular history, and if so, how much of it did you know? What are some of your favorite pinball machines and why? Let me know in the comments. While you're there, please leave this video a like, and if you haven't, consider following the channel. That helps me out a ton. For now though, thank you once again for spending part of your day with me, and until we meet again, happy gaming!